In August 1962, just days after Marilyn Monroe's death, a 36-year-old magazine editor walks into a Chicago bank on Michigan Avenue. He doesn't look like a man closing a chapter. He looks like someone collecting paperwork. He asks for a folder that was never meant to matter. Inside is a contract tied to photographs taken years earlier. Images of a woman who is already dead, signed under a name that barely resembles the one now echoing across the country. No one pauses. No one asks whether this document should still exist. Those photographs will soon make him unimaginably rich. They will anchor a brand, fund an empire, and turn a struggling publisher into a cultural force. The woman in the images will never be told. She will never be paid again. She will never know that her body, captured once, cheaply, without foresight, became the foundation of someone else's forever. This is not a story about love. It is not a story about scandal. It is the story of how a myth is claimed, quietly, legally, and without permission. Let us know where you're watching from, and we hope you enjoy the story. The light in the rented bungalow on Victory Boulevard never stayed on for long. It was paid for week by week, the way groceries were, the way bus tickets were, the way everything in Norma Jean's life was, small, cautious, measured in days. In 1949, she counted her cash in the kitchen drawer, under a stack of unpaid bills and screen test rejection letters. $50 would keep the place warm for another month. It would buy groceries that did not come in tins. It would buy a little time. Tom Kelly arrived with 2 cameras and no small talk. He did not ask her about auditions. He did not ask what she wanted. He explained the light, the angles, the curtain he would use as a backdrop. The room smelled faintly of soap and old wood. When she undressed, it was not done as a performance. It was quiet, practical, almost clerical, an exchange of a body for a receipt. The negatives were filed, labeled, and sold to a photo agency that treated faces the way warehouses treated spare parts. By the end of the week, her name was no longer attached to the images. They were stock. 4 years later, in Chicago, a man with no office, no staff, and no safety net sat at a borrowed desk and studied those same frames. Hugh Hefner was assembling his first magazine with money from friends, relatives, and a stack of IOUs. He needed a promise on the cover, something that would make a stranger stop, hesitate, and then reach into a pocket. For $500, he bought 2 photographs whose model was listed under a studio alias. The deal was clean, fast, and impersonal. He did not call the woman. He did not try to find her. The presses were already booked when a clerk mentioned that the girl in the pictures was now appearing in films under a different name. The name had begun to travel. Marilyn Monroe. Hefner read it twice, then a third time, as if checking a figure on a balance sheet. He could cancel. He could lose the deposits. He could start again. Instead, he made a decision that would set the tone for everything that followed. Within 48 hours, the cover was rebuilt. Her name was placed high, clean, unmistakable. There would be no issue number, no month, no year printed on the magazine. He did not know if there would be a second issue. He did not want to promise continuity he could not pay for. What he could offer was a single, precise gamble. One woman's name as a doorway into a new brand. 70,000 copies went out with no advertising budget and no national distribution. They moved through drugstores, barbershops, and newsstands by word of mouth. By the time the printers finished, most of the run was already spoken for. Hefner watched the receipts come in, each one a small confirmation that a myth could be assembled from paperwork, ink, and a pair of borrowed photographs. In Los Angeles, Marilyn was being fitted for dresses she did not yet own, practicing smiles that would later be described as luminous. She had no idea that the quiet afternoon she had traded for groceries was now circulating in another city, carrying a new weight, earning money she would never see. Her body had begun to work without her, turning into a mechanism that generated value in rooms she would never enter. That first magazine did not sell desire as a product. It sold a story that was only starting to take shape, the suggestion that one name could stand for a whole future. Hefner did not know how large the future would become. He only knew that it had just answered him back. By the spring of 1953, the magazine that had almost not existed was being stacked in windows on Michigan Avenue. The logo was still unfamiliar, but the cover image had become instantly readable. Shop owners learned, faster than any marketing manual could have taught them, which issue would not sit long on the shelf. By the end of the year, the same first number, unchanged, undated, already treated as an artifact, was being pulled from storage and offered again, this time with a thin ribbon of paper around it that called it the original. It sold better than several of the current editions combined. Hugh Hefner watched the pattern form, and then repeated it. The early print runs were repackaged, rewrapped, and redistributed. What had started as a precaution against bankruptcy became a reliable stream of income. No new photo shoots were required. No negotiations were necessary. The woman in the frame had already given everything the business needed, and she had done it years before the business itself had been born. In Hollywood, Marilyn Monroe was beginning to learn the other side of visibility. She was photographed daily, measured by column inches, ranked by box office returns. Her contracts were dense with clauses and conditions. She was praised in public and managed in private, and she grew careful about what she said. When a reporter finally asked about the old nude photographs, she laughed lightly, dismissed them as a harmless chapter, and suggested that she had no regrets. The answer was printed, clipped, and filed. In her personal correspondence, the tone was different. In letters to friends, she referred to the pictures as the cheapest contract of my life. The words were never meant for publication. They were an admission of how early decisions could harden into lifelong limits. By then, the reissues were already moving through the same channels as new releases, tagged as collector items, priced above the cover value, and quietly responsible for a significant portion of Playboy's revenue. Hefner began to understand that he was no longer selling pages. He was selling continuity. The magazine became less about who appeared in it, and more about what it represented, a private promise of choice, comfort, and modernity. Marilyn's image, never updated, never replaced, was positioned as the opening note of that promise. Her presence suggested that everything that followed was part of the same lineage. He spoke of freedom in interviews, of a new American ease. He avoided technical explanations. The business, he implied, was simple. People recognized a symbol and responded to it. Internally, the lesson was written more precisely. A myth could be maintained with minimal input if it was anchored to a face that the public had already decided to remember. Marilyn, moving between studios and sound stages, remained outside that system. She had become the country's most reproduced figure, yet one of the most restricted in how her own past could be used. The laughter she offered to journalists protected her public standing. The letters she sent to friends preserved a quieter record. By the end of the decade, the magazine's growth curves were studied in universities. Hefner's name was becoming shorthand for an era. And at the base of that rising structure, unchanged and still working, was a pair of grainy photographs taken in a rented bungalow, continuing to earn without a signature, without a conversation, without a reply. The news broke before dawn, moving faster than verification. Radios murmured it first, then telephones rang with a different tone than usual. By mid-morning on August 5, 1962, the name was everywhere, spoken with a caution that suggested disbelief. In Chicago, inside a printing plant that smelled of ink and hot metal, the day's schedule was quietly interrupted. Machines slowed, then stopped. Plates were lifted, reset, and locked again. No announcement was made. The decision did not require one. The next issue was altered in silence. Her image, already familiar, was positioned with care, neither sensational nor distant. The change was treated as routine, logged as a technical adjustment. By the time the presses restarted, the story outside had hardened into certainty. The magazine reached the stands carrying what the public already felt, that something had ended and something else had begun in its place. Sales followed immediately. Not gradually, not as a trend, but as a surge. Copies moved in multiples of previous benchmarks. Requests came in for earlier issues, for anything that included her face. Warehouses that had once been considered overstock were emptied within weeks. What had been archival became essential. The numbers were reviewed without commentary. They did not require interpretation. There were no internal debates about tone. No statements of grief were drafted. The approach was consistent with how the business had always handled her presence: precise, controlled, detached from biography. The image functioned as an anchor. Readers returned to it again and again, not for information, but for recognition. In death, she became fixed in a way life had never allowed. As the decade progressed, her appearance was woven into the magazine's rhythm. Special editions appeared without urgency, yet sold with certainty. Advertisers responded. Circulation reports reflected a new baseline. She was no longer an origin point alone. She had become a stabilizer, a reference that resisted change. During this period, Hugh Hefner made a private purchase in Los Angeles. The location was not advertised. It was not accompanied by explanation. A crypt was secured at Westwood Memorial Park, positioned directly beside hers. When the fact later surfaced, it was framed as admiration, even sentiment. The framing held because it was simple. What remained unsaid was simpler still. Proximity carried meaning, and meaning retained value. The choice did not alter operations. It did not slow production or redirect strategy. It aligned with an understanding that had been forming for years, that legends outperformed lives, that permanence could be arranged. By securing a place next to her, Hefner positioned himself within the narrative he had helped amplify, ensuring adjacency long after relevance would otherwise fade. There was no ceremony, no shared history to recount, only alignment. By the end of the 1960s, her image had become a permanent fixture, unchanged and endlessly effective. The woman was gone. The symbol was complete. By the end of the 1960s, the house on Charing Cross Road no longer felt like a residence. It functioned more like a controlled environment, carefully insulated from the outside world. The gates closed with mechanical certainty, and once inside, time softened. Music drifted without urgency. Conversations overlapped and dissolved. People arrived believing they were stepping into freedom, yet everything, from lighting to pacing, had already been decided for them. The image was never displayed openly. No framed photographs on the walls, no shrine, no explicit references. And yet everyone who mattered knew. New playmates were told the story early, not as gossip, but as orientation. It was explained without sentiment, before contracts, before centerfolds, before the mansion itself. There had been a woman whose image opened the door. She was not described as a person. She was described as a beginning. This knowledge functioned like a quiet rule. You were not compared to her, but you were measured against what she represented: timelessness, accessibility, Silence. The message was subtle, but firm. The ideal did not speak back. It endured. Hugh Hefner resisted every suggestion to modernize the origin. Better prints were available. Retouching could have softened the grain, refreshed the tones. He declined each time. The original images remained untouched, preserved in their slight imperfection. They carried the authority of relics. Their age made them credible. Their flaws made them untouchable. As criticism grew in the 1970s, especially from feminist writers who questioned the magazine's influence, the response was calculated. Hefner did not argue statistics or defend editorial choices. He returned to the beginning. In interviews and essays, he invoked her as evidence of agency, framing the past as a declaration of independence rather than an act of necessity. The narrative was clean, persuasive, and repeatable. Over time, it settled into fact. Inside the mansion, luxury took on a colder edge. Silk robes, mirrored ceilings, constant motion. None of it suggested warmth. The environment encouraged detachment. Intimacy was abundant but shallow, endlessly replaceable. In this setting, the unseen presence of Marilyn Monroe was constant, not as memory, but as template. No one said her name aloud at dinner. No one needed to. The myth had absorbed the woman so completely that reference became unnecessary. What remained was a function, a reminder that visibility could be permanent, and ownership did not require participation. Hefner moved through the rooms with practiced ease, already aware that the house itself was becoming symbolic. It was no longer a backdrop for parties. It was a stage set for an idea that had outgrown its origins. The woman who once posed for $50 was now embedded in the structure, present without being present, alive only as long as the story required her to be. The cemetery was quiet, in a way Los Angeles rarely was. Even traffic seemed to soften as it passed the low walls of Westwood Memorial Park. In the 1980s, long before the decision became public knowledge, Hugh Hefner walked its paths without drawing attention. There were no photographers, no assistants hovering nearby. The visit was brief and unceremonious, handled through paperwork and discreet conversations. A crypt was selected. Payment was arranged. Nothing about it suggested impulse. Years later, when the details surfaced in print, it was framed as sentiment. Headlines leaned toward romance, toward the idea of a lifelong admiration finally finding physical closeness. Hefner did nothing to correct that impression. He spoke lightly when asked, deflecting with humor, as if the choice required no explanation. The simplicity of his tone encouraged others to supply their own meaning. What was never emphasized was timing. The arrangement had been made when Playboy's dominance was no longer assured. The culture that had once orbited the magazine was shifting. New media forms diluted attention. The certainty of relevance, once assumed, now needed reinforcement. And suddenly, a dormant connection reappeared in public conversation, carrying with it the weight of decades. When journalists began to mention the crypt, the story traveled fast. It reattached the brand to its most enduring association. Marilyn Monroe's name returned to headlines alongside his, bridging eras that no longer shared much else. The attention was respectful, almost tender. It worked because no one demanded clarity. Silence did the work. Her relatives declined to comment. There were no statements, no objections, no permissions granted. The absence of response allowed the narrative to remain intact. Without contradiction, the gesture could be read as devotion rather than design. The public accepted it as a closing circle, unaware that the circle had been measured carefully. Hefner aged visibly during this period. Interviews slowed. Appearances became rarer. Yet the story of the crypt remained fresh, resurfacing whenever the magazine's influence was questioned. It offered continuity at a moment when continuity was difficult to prove. Even as circulation numbers softened, the myth held. What made the decision effective was its restraint. It asked nothing of her. It required no participation, no consent, no revision. It placed him beside her permanently, ensuring proximity without risk. In doing so, it aligned his eventual ending with her eternal stillness. The press would later describe it as a love story. Hefner never used the word. He did not need to. The arrangement spoke in a language he understood well, one where placement mattered and meaning followed. By the mid-1990s, the atmosphere had changed in ways that could not be corrected by design. The language that once defined liberation began to sound dated, then defensive. Playboy still existed everywhere, in archives, in reruns of old interviews, in the collective memory, but its authority no longer felt automatic. The world it had helped shape had moved on, and the magazine was now required to explain itself. The reassessment did not arrive as a single accusation. It came gradually, through essays, documentaries, university courses that revisited the sexual revolution with a colder lens. Younger voices no longer spoke of icons, they spoke of systems. Marilyn Monroe's image, once framed as a declaration of choice, was reinterpreted as evidence of imbalance. What had been sold as freedom began to look like exposure without protection. This shift mattered because it altered the weight of old facts. It had always been known that she never signed a contract with Playboy, never approved the use of those photographs, never received compensation beyond the original session fee. For decades, that detail had rested quietly at the bottom of the story. Now it rose to the surface, not as trivia, but as context that could no longer be ignored. Hugh Hefner sensed the change before it fully formed. His interviews grew broader, less specific. When asked about Marilyn, he redirected toward the era, the culture, the optimism of the time. He spoke in frameworks rather than names. The woman who had once been his most reliable reference point became increasingly absent from his direct language. The omission was noticeable. Inside the mansion, time pressed forward unevenly. The setting remained elaborate, but the energy thinned. Guests were younger. Hefner was not. What once felt like the center of a movement now resembled a preserved environment, maintained more out of habit than necessity. The myth still existed, but it no longer shielded its creator from scrutiny. Articles began to frame the legacy differently. The question was no longer what Playboy had represented, but what it had taken. Marilyn's image, once used to legitimize an idea of sexual autonomy, was now cited as an example of how easily narratives could be constructed around women without their control. The same symbol that had built the brand now complicated it. Hefner did not publicly argue. He had learned long ago that resistance often strengthened opposition. Instead, he leaned into abstraction. He spoke of progress, of conversations evolving, of history being a product of its moment. What he did not do was reclaim the story at its source. That silence marked a turning point. For the first time, the legend worked against him. The permanence he had cultivated became rigidity. The myth could not adapt, and neither could the explanations that once supported it. What remained was an empire still standing, but no longer unquestioned, anchored to an image whose meaning had shifted beyond his control. The final arrangement was carried out without spectacle. In September 2017, the announcements were brief, factual, almost restrained. Hugh Hefner died as an elderly man whose name no longer commanded the culture the way it once had. There were no parades of memory, no attempt to revive the old mythology in real time. The ceremony was private. The logistics were precise. At Westwood Memorial Park, the crypt that had been purchased decades earlier was opened as intended. The placement was exact. Stone beside stone. No symbolism was explained aloud, because none needed to be. The physical proximity completed a decision that had been made long before relevance, before decline, before reassessment. It was not a reunion. It was an alignment. In the days that followed, the obituaries appeared. They followed a familiar pattern, recounting innovation, controversy, influence, and, almost without exception, they mentioned her. Marilyn Monroe's name surfaced again, not as an aside, but as a necessary reference point. Even in his ending, her presence remained structurally essential. The story could not be told without her. It never had been. There was no reciprocal moment, no new understanding revealed. She had not chosen this connection, and she was no longer in a position to reject it. The silence that surrounded her family remained intact. Time had done what argument never could. It had removed the possibility of response. Visitors to the cemetery noticed the pairing quietly. Some paused. Some took photographs. Others walked past without recognition. The arrangement did not ask to be interpreted. It simply existed, permanent and resolved. The distance between intention and effect had finally collapsed. Only then did the shape of the entire story become visible. What had begun as a transaction, continued as branding, matured into mythology, and hardened into legacy, ended as placement. A final gesture that appeared gentle on the surface, yet carried the weight of 40 years of consistency. He had not claimed her voice. He had claimed adjacency. There was no moral offered at the close, no verdict delivered. History did not lean one way or the other. It remained still, the way stone remains still. One name had been used to build an empire. The other had been attached to it until the end. She never knew. He never explained. And between those two facts, the story found its final, unanswerable balance.